right, so welcome everyone to this session on Smart Tech, Green Planet. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this exciting topic. And we will discuss together how we can make better use of AI to monitor sustainable sourcing of commodities and how we can have a positive impact on the world. And I have to excuse Maxim Neumann. He cannot make it today, unfortunately, but I will jump in for him today and give a statement from my perspective. So we should be all fine, lots of wisdom on the stage. And with this, I would like the speakers, invite them to introduce themselves. And I start with Inbal.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Inbal Becker-Reshef. I'm the director for a program called NASA Harvest, which is NASA's Global Food Security and Agriculture Program, and also represent a G20 program called GeoGLAM, which is really the international framework that brings together those using satellite data for agriculture.
Pleasure being here, Oliver von Hagen. I'm a sustainability advisor on sustainable strategy development, execution, regulation, and technology. I have served as a sustainability manager and director for Becker-Reshef for 9 years in our sourcing department, and prior to that I've worked with the International Trade Center, a UN WTO organization working on trade facilitation.
Great. Hi, my name is Ruth. Lovely to be here. I represent the German Agency for International Cooperation, GIZ for short, and specifically I work for a program called Fair Forward Artificial Intelligence for All. And as the name suggests, we work on ethical, inclusive, and sustainable projects related to AI. And my particular focus is on using AI for climate action and looking at its environmental impacts with a particular focus on women and marginalized communities.
Thank you so much. So now I quickly put on my panelist hat and give my impression on what AI can do. And I think there's three main things. So one thing for AI is that with AI, we can discover very subtle patterns in data that would otherwise remain hidden to the human expert. So for example, we can now come up with biomass maps or carbon stock maps to measure how much carbon is stored in the vegetation using optical satellite imagery. As humans, we would never be able to decipher these kinds of patterns in basically optical photographs from space. Totally impossible, number one. Number two, scale. So AI does allow us to scale globally. So we can spatially scale and basically monitor the whole Earth to map agricultural areas as much as we want to, with high accuracy and high resolution. Scale number one. Scale number two, temporal dimension. So we can do this all over again and again and again, this mapping exercise. So and we can also look back in time. We can leverage our satellite image archive. We can look back 40 years in time to see what commodity was growing where at what time, and so on and so forth. So from my point of view, three important points. Patterns we would otherwise not be able to recognize. Spatial scaling, so we scale globally. Temporal scaling. These 3 points are the 3 major game changers with AI concerned with protecting the environment, monitoring sustainable commodity sourcing. And with this, I come to my very first question to Oliver, because if everyone would know this and we would just implement it, we would probably save the planet directly. But there's then a lot of challenges in the way. And Oliver, you have been working in the private industry with Becker-Reshef for many years. And I would like to ask you, what makes ensuring sustainable sourcing of commodities so difficult from a company perspective?
So it starts with a few basics, right? If you look at the area of sustainability, of course, you'll find a huge number of definitions. So it starts with policies, principles that you're looking to implement in supply chains. So if you look at different companies, everyone will have their own definition, their own policy, their own principles of environmental and social requirements and criteria that they would like to implement in their supply chains with their suppliers. So policies is one. the multitude of policies, particularly. Although we have seen in the last years, probably last 10, 15 years, a lot of work on harmonizing and aligning policies and standards being used, we're still left with a multitude of different approaches and principles being implemented in supply chains. So if you look at the amount of companies, buyers, traders, and suppliers being active in commodity supply chains, this leaves you with quite a multitude of approaches and policies we're looking at. So this makes it very hard to have the leverage and push your approach throughout the supply chain. We need more harmonization and standardization. The second one is traceability. A lot of commodity supply chains are complex, are fragmented, include a number of tiers. Very often you work with 3, 4 different tiers or layers upstream the supply chain. More often than not in areas that are quite remote. So commodity supply chains are complex and you need to work through this complexity. That second challenge, complexity of supply chains, leads me to the third one, which is data. So if you don't know exactly who is in your supply chain, how are you going to collect the data that you need to either follow through your due diligence process or make claims on environmental impacts, on social safeguards that you guarantee as a company? So data collection is an issue. With that comes the quality of data. So you, of course, would want to ensure a certain quality of the data, certain consistency. You would want to make sure that certain data protocols are followed for you as a company to be able to most efficiently share the data throughout your supply chain. So this is third challenge around data. A fourth one, and as a result of this third challenge, technology. If you look at the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen a number of technology solutions being developed to collect data, actually. Data for reporting in a sustainability context, data for impact measurement, whatever the purpose, data for traceability, whatever the purpose might be. A large amount of technology and tools have been developed to facilitate, to make it easier for companies and other entities to collect this data. Of course, the technology is only as useful as the data that you put into those tools, right? So technology definitely, and AI being part of almost all of those tools in a sense of checking the data for quality actually and other attributes. Technology being helpful in this context, it also comes with another challenge, which is my fifth challenge. A lot of those tools are private, right? So they build their business case on them being or providing a superior technology, right? So our tool will make it much easier for you to collect all of this traceability data throughout the supply chain compared to other tools. It'll make it easier to integrate all of these different players and share the data with your customers and prove that you're actually doing all of these things in your supply chains and have these positive environmental impacts. So understandably so, this is how a lot of the tools advertise themselves. The issue is, of course, that positioning themselves in such a way, everything that they do, understandably so again, is private, right? They're not going to share their data protocols, their technology, their coding, the methodologies that they use, which leaves us with a situation that a lot of that data that is supposed to, or that's being collected to protect common goods, take forests as an example, isn't accessible to everyone. It's private. And that leads me to probably the challenge I'm most passionate about, is that we're trying to solve an issue, just taking deforestation as an example, with private approaches, whereby we're creating a lot of private realities or a number of realities on deforestation. One tool will tell you this about an area that potentially has been deforested in one place. Another tool will give you a different reality of actually what consists deforestation, what has been cut down. And so a very public and global problem comes or is being transferred into these different private solutions and pieces and realities. So harmonization of these approaches, of these standards, of methodologies, the industry coming together, all of the different private sectors in supply chains coming together, agreeing on a common approach is vital in solving these issues. And this is the fifth challenge, and I'm going to close with this one.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That's very insightful and interesting. Now that we have learned about the challenges, I would like to ask Inbal. So Inbal, you have been instrumental in GeoGlam to monitor the agricultural areas of the globe. You are leading the NASA Harvest program. And I would like to ask you, what has science to offer? What's the state of the art in science to help companies like Oliver's to sustainably source commodities?
So I think both of those programs, NASA Harvest and GeoGlam, a lot of where we're coming from is actually being able to translate science and data into tangible information products that can help drive decisions, but make sure that they're scientifically based. And so I think, how many of you in the room realize that NASA, or the European Space Agency for that matter, work in food security and in agriculture? Right. Sometimes there's not, right? And so I think going back to maybe where you started from, we have hundreds of satellites, Earth-observing satellites, pointed down on Earth, going around the Earth continuously and collecting tremendous amounts, petabytes of data about our land, about our oceans, about our atmosphere. And they're collecting this data both in terms of the visible spectrum that we can see, but also in other spectra that we can't see that have really important information about our Earth and our land and our agriculture. And so we are able to today collect information on every field around the world every day. And that means we can start to, or not just start to, but we are monitoring both in the long term, how has our landscape changed? What we can look at different policies, how have those driven decreasing in deforestation or intensification? What are the different patterns that are happening, right? That we can then gain insights from to ultimately help drive those decisions, help to start to provide standards. I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is nothing short of a revolution, I would say, in the agricultural monitoring capabilities. Because these ideas were always there, right? From the beginning of the satellite programs early in the 1970s. One of the big applications for those was, in fact, agriculture. But we didn't have the technologies and the capabilities that we have today to properly leverage those for insights that we have today. And so what we have today is both a tremendous amount of data, massive advances, both on the private sector and, of course, on the public sector side, on the data side. We have compute and computing powers and cloud computing that can handle that quantity of data, and we have a lot of platforms then for analysis. And so for one, that makes it a lot more accessible. When I was doing my PhD, just to give you an example, we needed to have a compute center for us to be able to process all these data. Today, any one of you can go on one of multiple platforms and provide this and process this kind of data. But I think that goes back to one of your points, which means that we now have a lot of maps of deforestation. The fact that you have a map does not translate that this is actually reality, right? What are the uncertainty? And that means that a lot of the burden of actually understanding this now sits with the users and understanding how was this made? What is the quality of this data? What is the uncertainty if I use one map or the other? And I think we're moving into more acceptable public domain data sets at global scales, at local scales, at national scales that can help to start to drive and inform these kinds of decisions. So in terms of agriculture and satellite data, which is where I can speak most intelligently, I think we're seeing also this petabytes of multimodal information, and at the same time we have massive advances in AI and in machine learning that is really needed for us to be able to take in all that data and process it and to come into insights, right? And so some of the areas that we can work on is mapping the global croplands, mapping crop types. Most of you would probably think that we know what is growing around the world at any point in time. And while we have a pretty good idea of the global croplands, we're still not at the point where we can say with every field, this is now a maize field, this is a soy field, this is a wheat field on a seasonal basis. Why is that important? Well, if we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about management practices, and we're trying to understand, well, which practices actually work best where? If we're going to incentivize and say we need to move to cover crops, for example, right? Well, one, can we map all of those? Do we understand everywhere, do cover crops really work? Because in some places, if you're very drought prone and you put a cover crop, that's going to suck out all the moisture of your field, and now when you come to the main season, that wasn't necessarily helpful, right? And so we know there are different practices that are going to work better in different cropping systems for different situations. And today, we don't yet have the full data sets that we need to actually fully understand that. And that goes back to your point of scale, right? And so we have a lot of data. A lot of that data actually exists in the private sector, right? How do we start to bring together the private sector with the public sector to have these insights on here are the different crops that were grown, here are the different environments, here were the management practices, and start to get the insights of if I move to a low-till system in my agricultural system, how many years is it going to take for me to build up that resilience and to build up that evidence basis that is really needed to then drive policies, right? Because today, a lot of that burden sits on the farmers, okay? We all know, I think maybe I should have started actually, if we're talking about food and food security, where we are today, it is one of the biggest challenges, food security, that we face today. Okay? We have almost 1 in 10 that face hunger around the world. And if you look at the statistics, they're pretty dire. At the same time, if you look at their wide ranges of estimates, we need to increase food production anywhere from 25 to 50% by 2050 to meet the growing demand, both in terms of population and demand for more protein and products. And we don't have another planet. We don't have more arable land that we can bring into production, right? So that means we need to become a lot more efficient. We need to preserve the land and the agricultural systems that we have today. Well, how are we going to do that, right? And at the same time, the incentives for farmers are not necessarily all there. We don't even understand all the risks that are implied, right? So we can't just say if you go to sustainable practices, everything's going to be fine, and you're going to be more sustainable, and your yields are going to go up, right? So we need a lot more data in that space to be able to drive those kinds of policies, whether it's insurance, and we have examples of working with a company on looking at, for example, nitrogen insurance, right? Can we look at, I mean, that's one of the main sources for greenhouse gases on the agricultural systems, and we know there's a lot of over-fertilization. And satellite data, for example, one of the things they can do is once we know what the crop is in the field and the growth stages, we can also look at the nutrient content, at the nitrogen content of the canopy. And if we can help to drive the applications to be more targeted towards what is actually needed and not over-fertilized, that can be a huge source of gains. And so one of the ideas, and this is in different spaces happening, there are different insurance companies trying to go in and say, well, we'll insure you if you decrease your nitrogen inputs to a certain level, and we'll still insure your yields, right? But we need these kinds of programs and incentives to help de-risk this kind of a transition. And I think I've gone way over time, so I'll stop there. There's a lot more I can say, but I'm sure we'll get more into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Inbal. So when we're adding more complexity to monitoring supply chains, satellite data, AI, there is a huge risk that we exclude a lot of people who don't have that expertise, who are maybe not part of a big academic institution or an international company. And I would like to ask the next question to Ruth. So, Ruth, you have been working on the African continent and a lot in Southeast Asia. And I would like to ask you, how can we include this underprivileged people, let's say smallholder farmers, women? Yeah? And what is the risk if we don't do so?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And indeed, I want to bring it back to the smallholders after those beautiful introductions and kind of bring it all together, right? So you've already mentioned a statistic. We know that women face a lot of dual challenges, especially in the global majority, when it comes to climate change challenges that impacts crop yield, when it comes to changing weather patterns, and also when it comes to access to technology, specifically to AI tools and AI skills. There's a huge gap here in terms of training. So we at FairForward address these dual challenges by looking at very context-specific issues to build open AI. I'm going to rephrase that, to build open source AI solutions, truly open solutions, and with smallholders in this case, and women, smallholders at the center of these solutions, right? To make it very concrete, I want to give you 2 examples. So in Kenya, we have been working with the Local Development Research Institute, which is a great organization, including great women researchers working there. And we have been building, well, they have been building with our support, a early warning system for food security. And so what they have done is to really go into the communities, go into the fields across different counties in Kenya, and have collected data from crop yields to crop types to soil quality data to farming practices in different dialects and different languages, have included open source satellite imagery and included all of that into a system, into the early warning system that can give immediate and real-time advice through an SMS channel, for example, in Swahili, to a farmer to say, now is the time to plant your crop, or there's going to be weather changes, be mindful of this and this. So this is one example in how sustainable and inclusive and open source solutions can be built together with the target communities. We've heard about data gaps. Data gaps are still a huge issue, especially in the global majority, when it comes to local, accurate, and high-quality machine learning data sets. In order to address that, we have been working with the so-called Lacuna Fund. Highly recommend looking that up, especially if you're a researcher in the field. They have been doing tremendous work on collecting high-quality data sets with researchers across the continent, but also in Asia and in Latin America, on problems related to food security, to yield predictions, to weather forecasts, et cetera, et cetera. And so these data sets are really important to improve AI tools for predicting crop yields, for example, in a localized context, to predict weather changes, and for pest management, for example. Then a second example, which we had the privilege to collaborate with ETH, the EcoVision Lab on, and our partners at Wordify, is related to smallholder farmers that, beyond food production, play a crucial role in biodiversity conservation and climate protection. So in Indonesia, we have been collaborating with local community organization for a participatory mapping of data related to biomass in tropical forests. And we have combined these data with, again, open source satellite imagery to look at high carbon stock forests, so forests that have a high capacity of storing carbon and sequestering carbon and therefore contribute to climate change mitigation. And so now we've been scaling this approach to India and Senegal for specific contexts, including biomass estimation, fire vulnerability maps, and also looking at NDC specific to carbon sinks with a ministry in Senegal. So all that to say, community is really the most important aspect of building AI solutions. We always bring it back to the target group, including smallholder farmers in this context, and then also the risks associated with that. Now, I want to keep it brief because I don't want to run over time, but I want to highlight 3 key risks that relate to smallholders and their risk of being excluded from AI solutions. One pertains to data sovereignty and specifically to privacy and data ownership issues. When it comes to AI solutions, we need data, high quality data, and that means that oftentimes we rely on smallholders in this case to collect this data. Now, it's important to not just collect this data in an exploitative way, but to really make sure that smallholders in this case are the owners and have a say of what happens with these data. And for that, we have been collaborating with the Mozilla Foundation, also a great organization to check out, who has been developing frameworks and ethical guidelines that look at how smallholders and how target communities can be protected, and even look at new licensing frameworks aside from the ones that are already there that specifically look at indigenous data sovereignty, at all kinds of risks that could be a risk to the target communities. The second one is the exclusion to marginalized farmers, particularly women. When we rely on tools and data that are focused on the industrial farms or on the global north, then of course we run the obvious risk of excluding smallholders in the global majority and specifically women. And so it's of crucial importance to provide this access to technology, provide training, provide financing, and ensure that AI systems consider these barriers, including providing technical support in a variety of devices, whether that's SMS channels and not a chatbot, for example, depending on what the community really needs. Local language support, we at FairForward work a lot on local indigenous languages, on different dialects, together with Mozilla as well, through the Common Voice platform, for example, to collect voice data to then build such systems in localized languages. And now the third one, and this is my passion topic, is the environmental footprint of AI. While AI has a huge opportunity to contribute to climate mitigation, it also has a huge risk of counteracting the climate goals we're working towards, right? And so we must acknowledge that large-scale systems, especially large-scale models, such as LLMs, require huge amounts of energy, water, data centers, and so this very much undermines the climate goals we are working towards, which is also a call to big tech when it comes to building Gen AI systems to take into account how much energy and water these systems use and also make that transparent, which is mostly not the case. And so at FairForward, again, we prioritize sustainable AI design, including smaller models and energy-efficient tools, as well as low-power models and inclusion of tools such as IoT AI systems to, for example, again in Indonesia, work with coastal communities to collect weather data that can be incorporated into AI systems for prediction of weather changes in coastal areas and for coastal communities. And with that, I conclude and hand back to Jan.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That's very interesting and really good to know. Thank you so much. So after we've heard from our experts, panelists, I would now like to open the floor for questions. Yeah, so please ask a question, and when you ask a question, please also say who you direct the question to. And if you don't say it, I assume one of them will answer. All right, so I see a question back there. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. These were really incredibly insightful opening statements. So one of the kind of unifying factor was actually that really the data on the ground is one of our constricting factors. And we are currently seeing this whole shift from complete open trade globally towards a more protectionist world order. And I wanted to ask, do you think, so this is actually to all of you, who's competent at this, do you think this kind of shift will facilitate or hinder data collection processes? Because, I mean, on the one side, it is harder to get the data from countries that are not friendly with your origin, but possibly it reduces trade networks and then supply chains easier to track.
So who would like to answer this? Ruth, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. I wanna answer from a perspective of the data collection itself, and then someone can add to the trade aspect, which is not my area of expertise. But I think you're right in saying it's a tremendous effort to collect these data. It's a time effort, it's a money investment that is often the limit, and it's also an accessibility issue, right? In terms of where do you go to the field when you go to a tropical forest? Is it owned by communities? Can I access the land? What's the kind of agreement? Do I need to, obtain consent? Which are all really important factors to consider, which is something we consider in our work. But that also means that the data collection takes up most of the time, actually, most of the work. But I do want to emphasize that data and data quality and accurate and local data are what drives good AI systems and relevant AI systems, relevant to target communities. So it is absolutely necessary to invest that. The question is, how do we do that in a sustainable way? And also from a funding perspective, how do we do that in a multi-stakeholder effort so that those who are supposed to benefit from this system do benefit? And that, I think, just to tease a bit into that direction, it's also a question of frameworks, and when open sourcing such data, you know, often the argument is, but then we put it out there and big tech can just take it up, you know, and that's a risk, that's a harm. So how do we safeguard these data as well, especially when it's very specific, community-specific data? Yeah.
Maybe taking it from a trade perspective, and thanks for giving me 3 minutes to think about it. I would need a bit more time maybe, but so from a trade perspective, yes, the world trading order is changing for sure. Some supply chains might become a bit less complex, a bit shorter, where possible, right? But then if you look at commodities, a lot of those commodities, well, they grow where they grow, and that's not going to change, although we do some changes happening already to growing areas because of the results of climate change. Palm oil, cocoa, coffee, look at other commodities, they will continue coming from certain origins, right? So from this point of view, I don't necessarily think that the way trade is changing, that supply chains, and with that data collection, so I'm taking supply chain complexity as a proxy for data collection efforts to make it a bit easier, but from that point of view, I don't necessarily think that it will be changing too much based on how trade regimes are changing right now. However, what is going to be an important factor is goals and objectives, right? Data collection, or at least one factor from my experience working in the private sector and in supply chains, one factor that makes data collection easier is a common goal, right? A common objective. What is it that you want to achieve with this data? How are you going to use it? What is it that you're going to prove? What are the hypotheses based on which you work? So this common objective and goal helps you in the data collection process. And potentially we see this shifting and this common approach and goal not being that clear anymore, being questioned more in the future. So this might be one factor making it more complicated. Now I've been thinking along supply chains here, but there are of course sourcing approaches, program approaches, sustainability work, other types of work, data collection approaches that are not necessarily based on supply chains, right? You might have a landscape approach based on whichever factors are important for you in a landscape. Might be pure geography or ecosystem driven, whereby the influence on trade, I think, is less important because you have a group of stakeholders on the ground in that given landscape that take community approaches, that drive data collection. There, I'm not entirely sure whether a world trading order that's changing is going to have an impact, actually.
Yeah. All right.
I can maybe add
please.
two quick
Please go ahead.
points to that now that I've had both of them to think through an answer. Picking up on two things you said. One, on the ground data side, I would absolutely agree this is critical for any model, right? Both for the training and for the validation, and agricultural systems look differently around the world. I would build on what Ruth has said and say that in smallholder systems is where we lack the most that kind of data, and I think we have a lot of biases in a lot of the data that's going into training models, and that is very critical. And all those considerations that you've talked about privacy, about who's going to own that data, who's going to ultimately benefit, become absolutely crucial. And I think one of the answers has to be co-development, right? So sitting on one side of the world and deciding what kind of data and data products are going to be important, and therefore wondering why, and then you produce a yield map and wonder why nobody used it. Well, if you didn't develop it, right, with whoever it was supposed to be, with the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya, for example, then why would they use it? Why would they trust it? So I think on the trade side, I would say, globally speaking, we are seeing some trend of looking inwards and less transparency. And overall, transparency in trade is crucial, right, for most of our food systems. And I can give a very concrete example, the war in Ukraine, right? Ukraine, everybody is aware of, is a really critical wheat producer and provider and exporter, as is Russia. Well, when the war started, a lot of the assumptions is that a big portion, anywhere from 20 to 50% of Ukraine's wheat production was going to not make it to, was not going to be harvested and would not make it out into agricultural markets. And markets moved on that, right? And I think, and actually we were asked by the Ministry of Agriculture in Ukraine to support them in assessing what the impact of this war has been. And what we found is around most of the agricultural lands were cultivated, were harvested in the occupied territories. That accounts for about 20% of Ukraine's wheat production. It's a massive amount of food, and we've done some calculations on how many people that can actually support. Yet none of that was reported because Ukraine now is only reporting on its own government-controlled territories. All the international organizations are reporting on the information they have, and satellite data became the only way to actually monitor what is happening in occupied territories. And when you talk about a country that size and that big and important on wheat markets, then having that transparency and information, then that wheat production wasn't lost and actually is making it into international markets, largely in the black market side. But that becomes really important. That's just one example that can really drive international wheat prices up, and that has an impact globally, and particularly in countries dependent on those regions. So,
yeah, thank you. We have 2 more questions. Question over there, and then over there.
Cool.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. Really interesting conversation, guys. I had a question a little bit in terms of the bridge between the private sector and the public sector. So currently, from a data perspective, we understand that the private sector they have a lot of sort of metrics in place. They have a lot of sort of they have some of the best architecture involved. They have some of the best talent. How can we sort of bridge that gap and unify that from a private sector to a sort of public sector? Because obviously from here, a lot of sort of, public sectors are sort of involved in sort of, making sort of the planet greener, sort of building in that smart tech area. So how can we collaborate rather than private sector sort of gatekeeping these sort of, positive things that they're, working on and the value that they have sort of attained in this area?
Yeah.
Oliver, you want to go first?
Thank you. I do need those 3 minutes, but
Yeah.
I'll try. I mean, I'll give you 2 examples where those bridges have been built in the past, and I think we can build on those examples going forward. One is a project actually that Barry Callebaut had with Jan's team at the EcoVision Lab in ETH, whereby we as a sourcing organization of commodities asked our suppliers to use the high carbon stock approach, which Ruth actually alluded to just now, so I don't have to explain anymore. But essentially the idea is to identify which landscapes are supposed to be protected because they sequester a lot of carbon, have a high level of biodiversity and other factors. Yeah. So we were asking our suppliers to follow that approach, to implement that approach, and to make sure that whatever they supply to us does not come from an area that has been recently cut down was high in terms of their carbon stock. So one thing is agreeing on that standard and pushing that standard throughout your supply chains. Another thing is actually being able to implement that. What we found when we spoke to suppliers in that context was that most of us could agree on implementing that approach. It is hard to argue against it, right? It makes all sense in the world, particularly looking at where we're heading right now. But no one really had a way of implementing that approach because the maps were lacking. So the standard was there. There was an organization that actually managed that standard and managed its implementation and had the sole mission of doing exactly that. But no one really had a tool that they could apply to make sure that, or to identify that these areas that based on that HCS approach, we haven't touched actually in the past 5 or 10 years, however you define your cutoff date. So we said, okay, we hear you, you need some guidance, and you actually need the technology and the tool to be able to not only protect those areas, identify them, but also prove to us as your buyer that you're protecting them. So this is where we bridged the gap of private and public and went to Jan and his team and the EcoVision Lab, say, hey, we have this standard, we'd like to implement it in supply chains, but neither us nor our supply chain partners have the tool to actually do so. Can you help us? And they did, and with Jan and together and team, we have developed HCS maps that then going forward we could take as a basis of, or as a baseline of which are the areas, at least in those countries that we implemented them for in Southeast Asia, that we had a baseline and some maps to take as a basis of areas that we wanted to protect, taking that approach. So this is an example of where we define the standards, we define the approaches that we would like to implement in supply chains, but to make this approach implementable actually and usable in a private sector, real world kind of setting, we reached out to the public sector and used their talent and their knowledge in finding a solution to this. So, the second example, I'll be short on this one, but if you look at what the EU has been developing on deforestation regulation and the information system that they have developed and are currently developing and improving, that is supposed to collect a lot of polygons, so basically maps from all over the place that companies need to provide to the EU to prove that, well, the commodities that we're supplying into the EU, that we're importing or that we're buying within the EU, or actually exporting, do not come from areas that have been deforested recently. So as a public entity, the EU is developing this database. Now I think it's up to the private sector to make sure that companies are put in a position that they actually can comply with the regulations put in place by the public space, right? So this actually will foster a lot of collaboration between public and private partners. We've seen this last year, and we're obviously continuing to see this because a lot of companies are reliant on the technology to comply, on the right technology, and on technology partners to comply with what the EU has been developed. So another example, I think, where that really has been driving this development that you've been alluding to.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question back there, and then we have a question down here, and then probably last one there.
Hi, John Klepper from PIPRA. Thanks very much for the really interesting talk. My question is for Inbal. So I was actually going to ask about what are NASA's, in the last few years, what are some tangible, measurable outcomes, positive outcomes that you could talk about? And you gave a great example just now about Ukraine, for example. Perhaps there's a couple of others you could expand on, because I'd be really interested to know about that. And also, what are the goals for the future?
Yeah, well, a lot of really good questions. I think I should say NASA is doing a lot of work in this space. I can, on the NASA Harvest program side, I think the Ukraine work has been a key part of us, but I think it fits into a bigger picture for us, which is one of the things that I should say when we started this program wasn't actually front and center for us, and it is now driven by a need, which is building a new agricultural rapid response center for informing policies, right? And so we're getting a lot more requests, whether it's due to extreme weather events like floods and droughts, and looking at, well, what are the implications of that for trade, for how, what our production losses would be. That's one category. Two are wars and conflicts. And so you have Ukraine, but you also have Sudan, right? A famine-stricken area at the moment because of the civil war. You have DRC. You have a lot of parts of the world that food security and conflict, and in fact, armed conflict is one of the main drivers of food insecurity, right? And so again, that becomes one of those places where that's the only way to monitor those areas by satellite data. And then the third category kind of goes back to the question earlier around transparency in markets, right? And so you have certain parts of the world that can drastically drive agricultural markets and prices, yet often you don't have the transparency and you don't have the data in a timely way, whether it's intentional or whether it's there's no capacity or the estimates were wrong. But either way, it's really important to be able to have those. And so we are building an international distributed center that is going to be able to respond to requests, whether they're from governments, from humanitarian organizations. So I would say that's one major area for us going forward. We're working a lot on climate and agricultural de-risking, and working at both with insurance, both on the side of the sustainability side, but also on smallholders, right? I think if you look at the world and farmers, smallholder farmers are by and large do not have access to insurance. And we know that that's one of the ways that you can then build resilience. And so again, looking at how do we build and develop and partner to build in data for supporting index insurance and being able to make that more accessible. We work a lot on early warning with a lot of the different early warning organizations. So there quite a, I mean, I could go on for a while, but all of those are areas that are key for us, where we have had a lot of impact and results, but also where we're driving forward. But again, I would say kind of a key for us is, as our program, is always to start with our stakeholders. Because if we're going to have an impact, that has to be driven by our stakeholders, whether it's a Ministry of Agriculture, whether it's a humanitarian organization, or whether it's an insurance company, where we can provide the expertise on the data and on the satellite data side, but it's a really co-development with ultimately that transition into their capacity to run and operate these systems and information.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Inbal. We have another question here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Michael Anthony with Vertify, and I would like to come back to Oliver's sort of opening remarks that you also picked up later on between open source data versus proprietary data. And you gave this example how different data and different algorithms can come up with different results. So there is deforestation in one data result and there isn't in another one. And you suggested data harmonization as sort of one need to overcome the challenge. And I wanted to go one step further and seek your views on that. Isn't it that if data remains proprietary or algorithms remain proprietary, how will you be auditable? How will an auditor provide assurance? And perhaps you could refer to some practical challenges on that one, or any other auditor in the room. And if Jan permits, and you have one more minute for thinking, I'd like to comment on one of the previous speakers.
Okay, short.
Okay. On sort of data protectionism or protectionism in data collection. I think this is already something that I observe on the space side of things, which is obviously a very unregulated sector. But I came across a project in India where a company is differentiating between different cotton harvesting or cotton practices, regenerative versus traditional. And they were faced with a lot of issues, mostly political to extent regulatory, by government stakeholders in India who did not want them to collect that type of data. So I think that the tendency of protectionism that we are seeing is also making our data collection efforts challenging. But now back to Oliver.
Yeah.
Your response.
No, very good question. And I'm definitely not the expert when it comes to data collection methodologies around using data in a remote sensing context as well, when we talk about deforestation observation, right? However, the auditing question is, of course, a key one. And you can, of course, set up an audit system where you share proprietary data with the auditors in that context of the audit. So I don't think that is an actual issue. The bigger issue is actually for those auditors carrying out the audit, how do you define the highest quality methodology that you apply, right? So how do you, or what's the basis of your definition of, or a common agreement on, well, this approach to, or this methodology applied by one tech provider of remote sensing for forest monitoring is superior to a methodology used by someone else. And you'll probably find 5, 10, 15, and there, I think we have the experts here on the right side of the panel, or your left. How do you agree on that highest quality methodology? Because you'll need to do that to get to audit results that are actually really valuable to the public. Because an auditor otherwise will only audit whether you have followed the rules that you set out yourself, right? Which is great. But then, well, there might be other public rules that are actually more appropriate or of higher quality or more appropriate to the solution, to the problem that you're trying to solve. And that is the key. How do we define that, and how do we make sure that those auditors actually follow these? So right. I think that's the bigger problem here.
Thank you very much, Oliver. We have one last question.
All right, so my name is Sebastian Graf. I'm the CEO of True Carbon. I've been working in the space for quite some time, actually building lib spectroscopy sensors for soil. One of the challenges that we ended up having was that remote sensing is so much cheaper, and the estimates made by it are so much more favorable to the companies that would sell certificates. So we ended up with basically getting run out of business by this problem that you can't sell high quality data to the companies that would then take it to the public market. I'm gonna take a slightly different approach from this from the AI perspective and ask, if we are building models that are basically trying to predict our food supply on a global basis in the future, we don't have reliable data on this, how do we red team this? How do we make sure that those models are actually accurate and correct to the state? And to your knowledge as a panel, do you have any ideas how that could work?
Ruth, maybe, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah, let's chat after. Very interesting background. We actually had a few projects on estimating soil quality and carbon content by sampling the soil with smallholder farmers and using a combination of satellite imagery and AI models. And so our approach to this is very specific to GIZ, but I believe you will resonate too, is to work with the target community for the data collection to obtain accurate data, and then for verification purposes and to integrate it into any kind of food security systems, any kind of plans by the government with specific ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture or anything related really to the specific field then, and to verify that with existing, for example, maps, soil quality maps, or any kind of frameworks that exist by relevant ministries, and then go back to, a specific field, for example, to verify that with the community. So we have that kind of system. Whenever we implement a model, we always go back and validate it. So it's like an ongoing kind of process, which I believe is an essential part of improving any model, right? The human in the loop kind of aspect, and bringing in the perspective of smallholders. To give a concrete example, we would go, the early warning system I mentioned earlier in Kenya would go back to communities to look at, is that measurement of your crop actually accurate? And if not, what other information would you need from us? Is the language, that gives you prediction accurate? Is the dialect accurate? Is it accessible to you? Oftentimes the answer is no. So then we have to go back and rebuild that model in a better way and in a more applicable kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
just a short
answer. Okay, I mean, I think it's an excellent question and so critical, right? I think the ground data has to be in significant statistical frameworks, right? It's got to be collected consistency. You've got to can't just be a one-off, this year we're going to collect the data. And you've got to have uncertainty metrics. And I think that's part of the problem. It's great we have a lot more data, it's great we have a lot more tools to analyze it, but that also is then to your point where you have a lot of garbage, or you have data that you don't know what the uncertainty is. And so I think the ground data and the statistical frameworks and how you validate it, how you actually generate information from that data with uncertainty, with biases accounted for is a massive challenge, and it's absolutely critical.
All right. Thank you very much. So time is flying. Time is flying. No. Time is flying. We have to stop. We can talk bilaterally afterwards. So before we close this session, I'd like all three panelists to provide a short answer to my question. What would be your dream application for AI and environment? What's your wish? Inbal.
Gosh, we would need a whole session for that. I'll just choose one. I had like a few thought through, but I think coming back to some of what we've talked about is having the private sector, having the public sector really understanding and finding mutually beneficial ways of bringing that data together to ultimately provide the insights. If we had to talk about management practices, right? And how do we develop that evidence basis that's ultimately going to help us make the policies and make the programs to assure and that we can understand how to move forward and into a more sustainable agricultural system. And I think on a broader scale is really the adoption of satellite data by many more organizations and governments to be able to monitor their own agricultural systems and production to inform their own decisions.
Yes, Oliver?
I'll go back to the private and public approaches, technologies, tools, and databases as well. And I would love to see AI being used in a context of harmonizing and standardizing, making sure that data is consistent and of high quality, not only within each silo of private technology being developed, but also between. So making sure that there's a common approach based on AI and AI being used to make sure that the data quality across these tools is high, and making the bridge to public systems, so making sure that there's an alignment also between the public and the private world.
Thanks. Ruth.
Okay. So I actually am a microbial ecologist by training, so I always look at, the soil microbes and the pathways they drive, the micro scale to the macro scale to satellite images, that look at global ecosystem dynamics. And AI, for me, is a bridge between those scales, and we're still yet to figure out from the microbe to, the macro perspective, to the carbon stocks and tropical forests, to crop yields estimates, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, and I'm a science fiction fan, Octavia Butler is one of my favorite writers, and very timely now, she looks at those ecosystem dynamics and power dynamics as well, and how to use tools for transformative justice. So I'm including that into my ideal, kind of application to build just tools that leave no one behind in this context, smallholders, for forest conservation and for food security. Point period.
So thank you very much. This closes the session. I hope this was an inspiring insight to all of you.